welcome everyone. As you're settling into your virtual seats and getting yourself comfortable, make sure you're comfortable for the next hour or so. Really pleased that you can join us. And I've noticed on the list, and I hope she doesn't mind, but I'm aware that Caroline Huntley, our new NADP chair, as of today, is in the virtual space with us. So welcome, Caroline, and congratulations. As Lynn mentioned, do use the chat as we work through, and there is the Q&A button at the bottom. So do ask any questions, and we'll have times for some questions as we work through the session itself. But I'll pass you over to Lynn for any kind of quick housekeeping before we make a start.
Okay, right, numbers are settled down now. So welcome all of you to week 4 of our conference. As I said before, captions are being supplied by Captioned, and the link is in the chat there for you if you need it. Couple of bits of housekeeping. We've mentioned before about the fact that you can have CPD points for this conference. Now, we didn't want people to apply every week for CPD points, so I'll be releasing that next week so that you can apply, and we'll send you a certificate from there. More details will be up on the forum, of course. Week 5 bookings is open, and that's for our week on CPD, led by Paddy Turner. We're really intrigued with CPD at the moment. Such a vital thing, and yet why is it first to be cut when the finances are low, and how can we argue for CPD? Those are just a couple of the questions Paddy will be looking at. Apologies for the slight delay in putting up the week 2 and week 3 webinars. There was a bit of a problem with the editing and captioning, but they're very nearly there now. And last and no means least, the balloon race. We're holding a virtual balloon race over the course of the conference. And at the moment, we have Independence, the balloon called Independence, in the lead. It's actually got an 8-kilometre lead over Lake Isle of Innisfree. And there's quite a few close behind after that. I'm extremely upset. I'm in 22nd place at the moment, and Helen, my co-host of conference, has moved down from 8th to 32nd, so she's not happy either, but hopefully things will change with crosswinds over the next week or so. And that finishes just before conference next week, so we'll announce a winner. Now, it's my great pleasure to pass over to Brian, who is the host for this week, and it's his last official job as chair of NADP, and I've loved working with Brian over the last few years as director and as chair, and I'm going to miss him greatly, but I will look forward to working with Caroline as well in the next few years. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Lynn. Oh, you brought tears to my eyes. It's kind of like, it's yeah, momentous, and it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure working with you, and also with our membership over the years. So hopefully you're in the right session, my friends, and we're going to be talking about inclusive practice and in particular universal design for learning. Now, many of us will have come into contact with universal design for learning in the UK and globally. And we felt, as part of the international conference, exploring that and getting perspectives from across representative nations would be really useful, not only in terms of the context of the work that you may be doing in your respective countries or your institutions, but also in terms of any shared learning that can come from that, and also the possibility of exploring new contacts that can be made, because that's what this is all about. It's all about collaboration and working together and sharing best practice. So over the next hour or so, I'll be introducing you to our panel, and they will be doing mini presentations associated with their respective nations and sharing some of their experiences in that process. There'll be a short Q&A at the end of each mini presentation, but we will also be having a bit of a longer discussion at the end of towards the end of the session. Do feel free to ask any questions you may have, and the panel may answer some of those questions as the session is progressing, and do feel free to use the chat and share practice with each other and comments with each other. And between myself and Lynn, we may pick up on some of those as the session progresses. Most of all, do engage, have fun as a panel. I think we're intending to have a bit of a giggle alongside, so do bear with us. However, first and foremost, this is about learning and sharing learning. So again, be part of that process. So really, without kind of further ado, because we've got some timings to stick to, I'm going to hand you over to my close colleague, Dara Ryder, who is based in Ireland and is the CEO for Ahead in Ireland. Over to you, Dara.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Can everybody see that okay? Is that shared?
I can see that loud and clear.
Perfectly. Well, listen, thanks a million, Brian, for the introduction on it. It's fantastic to be here. I've made the NADP conference every year one of my sort of regular haunts, so it's part of my my summer every year now. So it's lovely to be here to share with you. And really, what I'm going to talk about briefly today is around universal design for learning. And I'm sure everybody in the room has some concept of what that means. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the actual concepts behind universal design themselves, but actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the misconceptions around UDL. Our brilliant captioner in the room today warned us beforehand not to use any choice language because it will be recorded, but I'm going to stretch that and say there is a lot of BS around universal design for learning and what it means in particular in relation to disability and how we support students with disabilities. So I'm going to start by addressing myth number one. Implementing UDL means no need for disability coordinators. And indeed, it's really what I'm playing on here is this idea that it's reasonable accommodations versus UDL, like there's some sort of competing dynamic here, that if we focus on UDL, then there's no requirement for support. That's really not what it's all about at all. So in front of you here, there's an image that's called the Inclusive Practice Pyramid. And what it's showing is the different levels of support required to achieve a university designed inclusive environment. Really at level one, which is the base of the pyramid, that's where we try to design in for all individuals to the greatest extent possible without the need for accommodations. In other words, we implement UDL in the teaching and learning curriculum. We have our physical environments as accessible as possible. And really it's about providing as much flexibility and choice so that we can meet the needs of the variability in our institutions as much as possible without the need for that specialist support. But then as we move up that pyramid, that specialist support is always required. And what UDL does is help us as disability coordinators to focus our energies where they're most needed, so those most in need of personal supports, rather instead than helping them to navigate often inaccessible environments and curricula in the first place. So we try to, I suppose, reduce our time and energy spent on that and instead focus on those who really, really need it. So we're going to rattle through because I know we're quite short in time, but I'm happy to answer any further questions on any of these. But this next one is actually related. So number two, UDL requires institutions to massively increase investment. So it takes so much time, it takes so much energy to implement UDL at a program design level. But actually, I would argue very much that what we do right now in terms of supporting our diverse learners is actually very costly in many different other types of ways. So what we tend to do is we tend to put up ladders for individuals to actually navigate inaccessible environments, inaccessible curricula, inaccessible systems of assessment. We're always trying to help them to climb those walls, So really, I think a lot of that is a question of priorities. Do we continue to put up more and more ladders and bigger ladders, or do we actually try to focus on smashing down those walls in the first place so that as many people as possible can engage fairly on a level playing field right from the off? And I'll give you an example here of what I mean by this. So in Ireland, 86% of students with disabilities actually receive one or more exam accommodations. Now that means there's this huge administrative burden that comes across, or comes around that. It's actually about 5% of the total student population receiving one or more accommodations as a result of disability. So often there are things like extra time, there are things like alternative venues, maybe the addition of a scribe or a reader in an exam setting. So there's a huge range of accommodations, and those needs to be done every single module that those individuals are engaged with, every single semester. So we're talking thousands and thousands upon thousands of individual accommodations. So the numbers there tell me if 86% of our students with disabilities, more than 5% of the student population, need these accommodations to navigate the exam, well, that's actually a problem in the assessment procedure in the first place. So it's a case of shifting our energy and resources over time to engaging with that. And from, I suppose, from the perspective of the disability coordinators, they have a really vital role to play in working, shifting their focus maybe not only to be just with the individuals, but also to working with the other departments around the campus to help them upskill with regards to accessibility and accessible practice, and indeed where they can input on accessible assessment practices and stuff like that. So, okay, number 3, UDL is about making learning easy. So often you get this thing there, what about quality? You know, what about quality in the process? What about academic integrity? Well, actually, UDL does not seek to reduce challenge whatsoever. That's not an aim of UDL. Challenge is an essential part of the learning experience. It's only by being challenged and having to overcome those challenges within an academic context that we can develop as learners and develop as people and individuals. What UDL is actually really doing is helping us to address the barriers to access the challenge in the first place. I think that's a really, really important point. And actually, if you look at quality assurance bodies over the world, many of them will actually recognize UDL as a high quality practice because it is evidence-based. You know, each one of the UDL principles, guidelines, and indeed the checkpoints actually go down to a very detail level with the research basis for them. You know, decades of research has gone into development of this framework, so it is a very high quality practice. And I suppose what we're trying to do is actually to build learners' capacity to be expert learners in the first place. That's the overarching aim of the UDL framework, is to develop expert learners. In other words, we help them to get a mastery of learning in the first place, so they can help themselves to strategize about how to use the knowledge they've learned, how to plan, you know, taking that knowledge to use it to plan and develop ways for them to succeed within their learning environment, and that they can use those and apply those practices across any other environments that they come to in their life. And just an example of checkpoint 8.2, vary demands of resources to optimize challenge. Learners need to be challenged, but not always in the same way. So it's about ensuring learners can actually access the challenge. Okay, number 4, to do good UDL, you need to be tech savvy. It's a big barrier, I suppose, to UDL, to engagement with UDL that we've come across, where people maybe who are not very tech focused in the way they've taught in a face-to-face context, especially, you know, suddenly they see this strong link between technology and UDL, and they see it as so something that you absolutely need to apply good UDL. The reality is that UDL can be applied in no-tech, low-tech and high-tech ways, and you can offer choice for learners on how they engage with learning, in how you represent learning, and how they take action on what they know, using no technology whatsoever. So it's very non-prescriptive. It's really reliant on the practitioners themselves, the teachers and learners themselves, to adapt the practices and the principles and the guidance for their own context, for their own learners, and I suppose to design it around their own skill sets as well. So it's really about your interpretation of the principles and guidelines for your learners is really vital to UDL. So I would say, you absolutely do not have to be tech savvy to implement UDL. Is technology a very valuable tool in the toolkit of implementing UDL? Absolutely, but it is not necessarily essential in terms of, you know, you don't need to become Bill Gates overnight to introduce good UDL practices. And then myth number 5, UDL can only be implemented at the program design stage. In other words, people think about UDL because it is a design practice. It's about designing curricula. They think about UDL as something that can only be done when you're developing curricula. And they also think of it as something that you have to achieve a holistic overhaul of your entire module in one go, which means that's a big barrier to engagement, because that is a huge mountain to climb for any individual, especially in the busyness of the last year that we have. So again, I would say that's a myth that's busted, because there's great work out there about how you can start small with UDL and begin with minor steps that help you to provide options for our learners to engage at the greatest points of need in our curriculum. So Dr. Thomas Tobin, who's helped ahead to develop our recently published UDL for further education and training practitioners guidance, which is freely available on our website, introduces the +1 approach to implementing UDL. And that's where we identify the greatest point of need in our curricula, which he calls the roadblocks, which are essentially those pieces where you find learners are repeatedly stumbling every year. You get asked the most questions, perhaps you have the most confusion from learners. Well, they're great points to start implementing UDL, to start providing options and choice for the learners and how they engage with the learning and how the actual knowledge is represented within it, and also in how they take action on what they've learned and demonstrate their learning within those areas. So if anybody's interested, you can go to ahead.ie/UDL for FET, which is a resource hub associated with this UDL for FET practitioners guidance. So there's a free book length guidance offered there in that resource, also a summary version and a whole suite of digital resources, including video case studies on how UDL is implemented. And I think I'm just about coming to the end of my 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So I might hand back over to Brian and let us get back onto the track with the session.
Fabulous. Thank you ever so much, Dara. I'll share with the group. Dara came on and he was pumped for the session today. And I just think the energy and your experience, and also the focus on dispelling those myths. And I think as you were working your way through them, I've come across some of those. And I think actually to dispel those myths is a really important thing for us all to recognize. There was a very good comment. I can't remember I don't know which particular myth it was, but it might have been myth 1 or 2. And Fiona Kolantari put on the chat, I'm so very glad you addressed this myth. So clearly that's something that people are recognizing in terms of their work, etc. Just wondering, Dara, at some point, would you be able to kind of put a link to those, to that information, because I think that would be really useful for delegates as and when you get time. Oh, you've already done it. Blimey. Thank you so much.
No problem. No time. One thing I just want to highlight, maybe that I didn't say maybe strongly enough actually, is that disability practitioners have such a big role to play on a UDL campus. You know, that it's actually, you know, it requires a bit of a shift in thinking about what the role is, because it's not just about engaging with students at the most point of need, but it's also having the space to engage with other aspects of the campus, you know, to ensure that they play a wider part of the conversation that is a whole college approach to inclusion very much.
Excellent. So we've got a question, and it's from Mandy. Hi, Dara, from a fellow Dubliner. I think UCD brought in an assessment menu for students a few years ago.
I think maybe, Mandy, you might be referring to the work of Geraldine O'Neill and Lisa Padden. I'm not entirely sure, but for some, certainly UCD is a hotbed of, in particular, with around assessment and offering choice of assessments. They've developed, one of the concerns from academics always around choice of assessment is about academic integrity and ensuring there's equity of choice in between those assessments for students. How do you decide fair outcomes? So UCD have done excellent research-based work that provides a roadmap for academics to do just that. So an actual templates, I think they call them equity templates, which allow academics to, I suppose, plan how they would do that in a kind of robust and quality assured way. So I think maybe that's what Mandy is referring to, and certainly there is a lot of that going on in UCD. It's not something that's mandated across the campus, but it is certainly something that they're very experienced with.
Yeah, thank you, Dara. I think Mandy's kind of done a follow-up question of, is this something that is still going? And I'm pretty sure from your answer, are you aware of whether that process is still ongoing?
Yeah, they've just done a big follow-up piece of it. I can try and dig it out during the session and post it in the chat. They're doing a follow-up piece of research on actually students' opinion of choice of assessment, what they felt on the other side of it, and how they reacted to being offering choice in assessment. So I can dig that out if I can from Andy over the session. I'll try and post it in the chat.
Thank you ever so much, Dara. Are there any questions from the panel at all? And it's fine if there's not, because Dara's fabulous. But have you got any questions in particular associated with the slides or the content? I've got Deborah and then Stephen.
So thanks, Brian, and thank you, Dara. That was a really brilliant presentation in terms of dealing head on with the myths that prevent UDL being implemented. So on the Disabled Students Commission, we did a series of workshops just in June, as the pandemic was, still quite new in the UK. And one of the things that became really clear was that in those universities that had already implemented UDL, there was much more flexibility in the shift to being purely online, and I think much more careful thought about the implications, because of course what we saw were that disabled students were affected in an uneven way, in a differential way, and I guess what's interesting about that is, you know, your point about UDL by design. So what did you see from your perspective during the pandemic? Did you see that encouraged some universities to actually rethink UDL, or is it that we simply had a lot that, you know, where people were sitting there thinking, I wish we'd done that a year ago, and there still hasn't been change?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we actually have is a much greater commitment to the ideas of UDL. I'll give you just an example from our national program that we run around UDL. It's the UDL badge. It's called National Training Program. It's a 10-week program for academics. We had a 500% increase in the engagement with that course, you know, last year. Like, absolutely incredible. So it tells you that the interest is there. I think what happened in the pandemic is that our ideas of access and what it means to have access barriers widened massively, and people were much more closely connected. The academics were more closely connected with the issues that were coming up against, and so that led them to UDL as a solution, because, you know, sometimes it's only when we need a solution most that we actually open our minds up to those things. So I think absolutely the experience has engaged. I think what our experience, the interest has exploded, but what we have seen is that the move to online has resulted in sometimes, you know, a much better inclusive experience. As you said, I think those colleges that already were embedded in this idea had a much better experience. We've also seen some very bad practice that is just as inaccessible, maybe even more inaccessible than the experience that they were having prior. Like, so online in and of itself is not accessibility. Online is just another path to learning, and it does offer us another mode of learning, another way for people to engage with learning. But actually the accessibility, choice, flexibility, those are the kind of key pieces across the board that we need to examine, and that, as I said, online of itself isn't actually accessibility. And we sometimes, I think those two things have gotten mixed up in this conversation about some of those things that we as disability practitioners we've been asking for a long time.
Thank you. Excellent question and fabulous answer. I'm just aware of time, and I've just sent Stephen. Hopefully this is okay. So Stephen, can we come back to your question at the end of the session? Because I think we can round that up. Would that be okay? Fab. Got a thumbs up. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dara. I'm going to pass you over now and introduce you to Judith Jansen and Martin Hovijzer. Hopefully I've pronounced your name right, Martin. Forgive me if I haven't.
It's Hovijzers or horseshoes.
Horseshoes.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and just for the benefit of our delegates, both Martin and Judith are co-delivering this particular section. So I'll hand you over to both of them now, and hopefully you should all be able to see their slides on your screen. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, Dara. In our short presentation, we don't focus so strictly on UDL, but we strike a bit of broader perspective on inclusiveness and flexibility, as Dara already mentioned. That's also an important issue. And we like to take you with our thoughts about how inclusive and flexibility education just meets or integrates, or at least just shake hands and work together. So Martin, if you show the next slide, just a short introduction of who we are. We are the Dutch Expert Center on Inclusive Education. And as you see, there are a lot of sentences on the slides, but just mentioning that we work together with all the universities of applied science within the Netherlands. We work together towards inclusive education, and we work together also with the institutions in the labor market in order to create inclusive work as well. And of course, we also take a good look at students, their special needs, and how they can be part of this conversation and our work. So 3 important issues for us being an expert center in inclusive education. And you can find much more on our website, of course. So if you show the next slide, I just illustrate you a picture. You might notice we think this is the best way to illustrate inclusive education. It's just one highway in 3 different lanes, but the most important aspect of this image is that all students ride on the same highway or ride a bicycle or a car. It doesn't matter how far how fast they will go. And in our particular job, we work specific for, of course, students with a disability. We already do that since, well, 75 years already, focusing on students with a disability. But the last couple of years, we also take a good look at the obstacles students experience due to, for example, sensory impairments, of course, but also mental vulnerability or chronic illness. And especially the last couple of years, we also take into account the well-being of these students, the mental well-being of all students, of course, but specific on students who do face up with obstacles due to their impairments or disabilities. So as we look at this highway, we look at all these students, all the obstacles they face. We don't want these obstacles, we want the solutions, but we take a good look at all the obstacles for the different group of students. And I have to say group, but I just heard this quote this morning I want to add. And this quote mentions, diversity is the mix and inclusion is making the mix work. So I think I love this quote, and it's just saying that diversity and inclusion is making the mix work, but also how can all students move on this highway. And another thing we started, and if you want to change the slide, Martien, then we start working with the student journey. I don't think it's new for you. For us, it was very helpful a couple of years ago. We just aiming at all the moments during the student process of all students. We picked up every moment that is in a way a universal moment for all students, no matter which obstacles or hindrances. So it starts with choosing your study. It's a key moment for all students, and of course also for students with a disability. And if you look at the picture very closely, I hope it's good to see, it's all these different student moments from choosing a study, starting your studies, earning credits, doing an internship, finding a job, going abroad, all these specific student moments, we think they're universal. And if you take a good look within these moments, you can easily identify key figures. Who are the persons who can support all students, but especially students with a disability within this key moment. And what do you think being a student, being a professional needs to be done to have a good moments and make these obstacles you might think are there smaller, and so you can easily go on the pavement of the high roads. And for us, it was very useful to look at these student moments. And from there on, we start meeting up with professionals who were thinking about and working with flexibility, because we did find out they also use this student journey, these personas, just to create flexible education. And that's how I also meet up with Martien, and I want to hand over the presentation to you, Martien.
I wanted to unmute myself, but it's, yeah. Okay, thank you, Judith. I will tell you more about flexible education. Why do we need flexible education? Well, trend developments such as globalization, technical development, and individualization have a major impact on the way we live and work. So a society fields of work and students changing, and on the influence of these developments. Of work, and our work itself will continue to change. An existing profession will disappear, or their content will change, with consequences for the professionals. And if professionals want to remain permanently deployable, this will demand a lot from the adaptability. And only by continuing to learn and develop can they continue to find their way in the world we live in. So because of everything is changing, we want to lifelong learning and development make possible, and so we need providing future-proof education. And we think that we are in need of flexible programs, and because each student has a different start, a different background, and a different learning style. And if we want to teach all of these students to adapt to change, let them discover what their strengths lie, and teach them to develop themselves, we must set that example in our education. So we should give students the opportunity to choose their own learning path, to learn what they find interesting and what they are good at, and also to provide future-proof education. So what we have done, of what is flexible education? Well, our definition is that flexible education means that education is able to adapt to changing circumstances and offers different options in the what, where, when, and how learning takes place, leading to a recognized diploma or certificate. And it means that it's able to adapt to changing circumstances. And that's exactly what we want students to be able to do at the end of their studies. So where we want to set an example for. And in the image you see, it comes from the FlexScan, and the FlexScan is a tool designed by my colleagues from CINO, used to map the perceived and desired flexibility over a school or university. And this tool supports education institutes to have an informed dialogue on the perceived and desired flexibility in education. Because flexibility is not the goal, but it's a means to lifelong learning, and it focuses on the perspectives of students, teachers and lecturers, program managers, policymakers, and the professionals. And the respondents can scan the flexibility of their learning method at 4 levels. You can see scenario 1, 2, 3, and 4. Scenario 1 is the standard program. That's traditional education, actually. Scenario 2 is a standard program with individual customization. So it's education with exceptions. For example, standard program with a program for excellent students, or with a program with more support on the side. Scenario 3 is flexible program, so education learning arrangements. And scenario 4 is personalized learning journeys. The respondents answer questions concerning the student journey, and that's what Judith also explained. And that's the journey a student takes from gathering information about a particular program to earning a degree. And we see in the Netherlands that many schools would like to move from scenario 2 to scenario 3. So no more standard programs, but rather flexible programs that give students more choice in learning. And we think that flexible education is inclusive education, because to design flexible programs, you need to know what your target group are. You have to make the personas, because you want to know what their customization questions are, what their wants and needs, and when and where do they want to learn. And yeah, that's the beauty of flexible education, because it meets the desire to provide more inclusive education. When designing flexible programs, you want to know your target group, and that's different for every school, but also even for studies within the same school. And you want to know what their wants and needs are. And what fits few fits often all. And when that's clear, you can start designing your education on that. And in the Netherlands, flexible education is a hot topic, but often directors or board members don't realize that flexible education also helps the student with support needs. And it offers an interesting starting point to have a conversation within the organization. It offers the board member to the possibilities to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So therefore, when designing flexible education, not only start from the regular students, but also look at the customization questions of students with support needs. And how to do that? Well, there's a great need for tools to help teams design flexible programs. And that's why we as CINOP has joined forces with 4 schools for vocational education to develop the flexible. You can see the overview on the slide. It is a method that allows teams to independently design flexible programs for their own teaching practice. And the method helps teams to ask the right questions and engage in the conversation about flexible education. And from there, to move from thinking to doing. Well, it's an overview from all the phases, and yeah, there are important steps to take to redesign your education. So that's what I wanted to tell you. I stop sharing. Oh, stop. stop share. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Martine and Judith. That's fabulous. And I was quite drawn by the path, you know, and I think you kind of said, actually, this might be something that delegates may recognise, or the other professionals on the panel may also recognise in terms of that design. You know, clearly the core of your thinking is around the flexibility of delivery to students, so that students can directly engage. We haven't had any questions necessarily to do with your presentation, other than for everyone's slides, there's a question about, will the slides be on the website? That's gone to Lynn. So perhaps Lynn will be able to kind of just respond to that in the chat as we work through the session. Are there any questions from the panel at all? Dara?
Hi, thanks, man. As always, really brilliant work. Very interested in. I know we've had some chats before, actually, in a separate forum about your flex scanning process, and I'm interested now in the tools. Like it's a development. Is that tool? I'm not sure if it's part of the flex scan process, but what kind of level are you going into in terms of your course design? Like, are you talking about the modes of delivery in terms of, like, for example, the ability for students to engage in like more modular study, or like, does it address things like hybrid learning, or, you know, what, when you talk about the level of flexibility that you're providing, is it mostly within the curriculum, or are you going out to that level of literally the modes that they actually engage in the program?
Do you want to start, Martine, or shall I start, or?
Oh yeah, start. Yeah.
Yeah, just referring to the FlexScan, Dara, we already that was on the side, or just mentioning that we see most universities are thinking about scenario 2 and scenario 3. So this means they do have flexible options, considering and trying to become better, to become more flexible, but they don't reach the end of the scenario 4 yet. So just illustrating, and that was not the correct answer, or the complete answer to your questions. Maybe Martina, you could add something about the start working with the universities or schools, and where do you start?
Yeah, with the flexible, you start already with a kind of vision where you want to take your education to, and the flexibility is on the curriculum, but also makes teams think about where learning takes place. Is it in school or in the practice, or wherever, and is it the hybrid you call, or more blended, or that kind of stuff. So it's within the curriculum, but also thinking about school's not the only place where you can learn. Is that an answer?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay.
Excellent question, and great answer. And I think, I mean, if we had much more time, I'm sure we could have an entire discussion just around that particular element in itself. And perhaps that's something that we can kind of follow on in further discussions further down the line. Thank you ever so much, Judith and Martine. I'm going to move across to our next presenter, who is the lovely Stephen from Ulster University in Northern Ireland, and who's also the country advisor for NADP. Over to you, Stephen.
Hi, Brian. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and just welcome to everybody today. I was delighted to be asked by Brian and Lynn to be part of today's discussion, and I suppose shared learning. So just a little bit about myself. My name's Stephen Harper. I'm an accessibility advisor at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, and I've quite recently joined up with the NADP as a country advisor to the board. So I'm really excited about that opportunity as well. And one of the things that Brian mentioned at the beginning was about us building links and contacts with each other as well. And I think that's really one of the key things here today. Actually meeting and learning from each other. I really enjoyed the presentations there by Dara and by Martine and Judith as well. And it's been great so far. So I suppose I'm taking a little bit more of a narrow perspective. We've kind of had the broad context of UDL. When I was listening to Dara, as a disability practitioner, I was jumping out and going, yes, that's true. I faced those kind of concerns and those myths coming back at me. So yeah, it really kind of hit home. So I'd say I'm going to take more of a practitioner's perspective. I'm an accessibility advisor or a disability advisor at Ulster University. So I work directly with the disabled students completing the assessments and putting in place the reasonable adjustments within the learning environment. So the focus of what I'm going to do today is going to be, I suppose, to mention some of the assessment alternatives, I suppose what they are and how they were implemented within my institution, within Ulster University, I suppose during the last year, during the pandemic. And I'm also going to touch upon some, I suppose, anecdotal evidence of some of the student experiences of blended learning and assessment. So there's no study here. It's basically been through my casework, the feedback that I've been getting from students. I suppose when I'm completing reviews, I'm asking them, what have been the challenges for you? What have been the positives and the negatives? So it's just to kind of touch upon and look at a few of those for some insights. And then I'm just going to bring up the question around assessment choice at the end. You know, so as we're kind of moving through this pandemic, I'm planning for going back to face-to-face teaching in class and exam hall examinations. What can we learn from the kind of the remote experience? And can we give learners and students the opportunity to choose that assessment that they feel best fits their needs? So really, should we consider, and that's a question for everybody, should we consider having more of a menu option approach moving forward? So I suppose an inclusive approach to assessment at Ulster University, it didn't really begin with the move to remote learning through the pandemic. So I thought it was useful maybe for context just to touch upon some of the initiatives that were happening prior to the lockdown in March 2020. So my colleagues within CHIRP, which is the Centre for Higher Education Research and Practice, they were involved with developing what we call the Integrated Curriculum Design Framework, and that's really an overarching framework that guides program teams to proactively design, develop, and deliver a more holistic and an innovative curriculum for our learners. And I suppose from the student wellbeing perspective and the accessibility service, we completed a series of joint workshops with CHIRP to ensure that we combined aspects of, I suppose, the mental health and wellbeing strategy at Ulster and taking into account, I suppose, the diverse needs of our student population, as well as our disabled students and reasonable adjustments and everything else. I suppose one of the outcomes that we're hoping is achieved from that is that whenever, I suppose, courses are going through either module revalidation or course revalidation processes, that it is an integral part to that. So getting away from this tick box mentality that it's something to be considered, that it's there, it's upfront, and it's at the center of all the decision making. So that's been a push, I suppose, prior to the academic as well. And I suppose there's been ongoing engagement from our Office of Digital Learning, working with course teams to enhance their skills and, I suppose, improve their confidence in producing more kind of creative content. I mean, one of the more recent initiatives that we've put in place now is we're trialing Blackboard Ally on our virtual learning environment, and that's really to support staff with ensuring that their content is more accessible. And I suppose it's a really useful tool for flagging up areas of improvement and to be able to track and monitor accessibility, you know, in terms of online content as well. And I suppose lastly, just to mention, I was actually involved at a course level with Mark Simpson, one of my colleagues who was course director in the School of Law, and we were actually running a pilot in terms of looking at assessment choice. So during that, we did actually offer students who were registered with the Disability Service and had a reasonable adjustment recommendation report in place. We offered them the choice of assessment, whether they wanted to have a traditional exam hall timed assessment, or they could opt to do an alternative piece of coursework as well. Now, that particular study will be completed at some stage. Unfortunately, we fell behind due to the pandemic, and then Mark has taken some time out for one of his other research interests, currently writing a book at the minute. So whenever Mark comes back next year, that's something that we'll visit again. But really the next stage of that pilot was to look at how we could put that out to, I suppose, everybody in the course. And then with the pandemic, all of a sudden, all course teams were faced with this choice in terms of assessment and looking at forms of alternative assessment. So in terms of an inclusive approach, I've used this little acronym CLEVER before whenever I've been working with some of our staff teams, and it's more just a guide to kind of support our approach. So by being collaborative within our institutions to promote joined up working, to try to avoid working in silos, and I suppose look at best practice externally as well. And taking advice and support from others who have been through that process before. By being leading, also, I suppose, taking a top-down approach through senior leadership, but also a bottom-up approach to implement universal design for learning. So it's really, I suppose, a whole institution response, creating that new culture and willing to set goals and embrace inclusive practice. And then from my time as a qualified social worker, I'm saying by being empathetic. So take the time to listen to the learners who face those barriers. Imagine what it would be like from their perspective. Take that time to understand their experiences and involve those students and learners as a key part of the process. Being encouraging, change the culture. What can we do? Be willing to take chances. Support and encourage teams to take chances, to be creative, be willing to fail. Some of this will be trial and error, and that's fine. And then finally, reflection. So make some time for reflection, evaluate and review. How was the experience after these steps were taken? What lessons have been learned? Have we grown as educators, as practitioners? If we were to do it again, how could this be improved? And again, take that feedback from the learners themselves. Okay, so for context, at Ulster University, we have over 2,300 students who have a reasonable adjustment recommendation report in place. Now, that's out of approximately 25,000 students across our 4 campus areas in Northern Ireland. And I suppose that for me, that represents almost, I suppose, 1 in 10 of our student population. And it was interesting to note there that Dara had mentioned some stats in his presentation, that it was about 5% of students coming through, if I'm correct, who had at least one individual kind of reasonable adjustment in place. And I suppose even within that group of 2,300 students, there's a lot of students there who might have not come forward, who may not have disclosed for a number of reasons as well. So in terms of ourselves, we work to provide some guidance. Myself and the head of CHIRP, who is Roisin Kern, we produce some guidance for the course teams prior to, I suppose, going into this period of blended learning or remote learning. And it was specific around assessment and what could be put in place, and I suppose what some of the alternatives for. Now, we didn't take an approach where we were prescriptive and advised course teams what they should do or what they must do, but I suppose we offered them a number of alternatives and I suppose asked them to think about their learning outcomes and what fitted their students best. So just to mention some of the different alternatives that were put in place. coursework again to the traditional time-bound exam hall examinations. Now, the majority of those did take the form of being able to complete exams over 24 hours or 48 hours at home, where it was maybe traditionally a 3-hour exam. Some course teams decided to allow for a week for that, but maybe they had slightly higher expectations in terms of referencing, etc. There was pre-recorded presentations and live Microsoft Teams presentations. We had short class exams. And again, there was an inclusive time allowance put in place for those. So they were provided online and there was 100% additional time. So if it was a 1-hour exam, the students were getting 2 hours to complete that. Some of the more innovative approaches, some of the lectures were proactive and they did complete voice recordings of the questions that were sent to students as well, and they were sent through by MP3 files and released through Blackboard Learn as well. So students who preferred to have that spoken to them as well, that was happening too. And I suppose Martine raised a point earlier on where she said what fits for one often fits for many. And I think that that's a really key notion here. And I'm thinking about some of the course teams who did do this, and it was after maybe chatting with myself, and I said, you're doing this for one student, so maybe we could put this in place for a number of students. And the other thing was consideration of allowance for work that was already completed at this level, so really kind of avoiding the traps of over-assessment. So some of the positives, and again, I must stress this is anecdotal feedback from some of the students that I have worked with. I suppose it just gives us an insight or a flavour of, I suppose, some of the positives and negatives of kind of remote learning and remote assessment. Some of the students, they felt that there was ability, that they had the ability to utilise their assistive technology. You know, so some students who had previously used a scribe or a reader actually preferred to be able to use their assistive technology and to complete that at home. In terms of coursework alternatives, a number of students fed back to me that this was like less expensive. There was less time spent traveling to and from university. There was less expense in terms of travel and food as well. And, you know, they felt that they could be more focused. They were able to catch up on their lectures at a time that suits. Now, this was really, really key. A number of students came back and said they were able to work around their own lifestyle in terms of, particularly during the pandemic, in terms of their own life commitments, family commitments, jobs, part-time jobs, etc. And being able to catch up at a time that suited them was really much less stressful. Recorded lectures were fantastic for revision, so to go over again when even completing coursework in week 6 or week 7, topics that were covered in week 2, the ability to go back and cover that material again really helped a lot of the learners and students. At-home exams were significant. I mean, I had one student with fibromyalgia, and he said it was the key to him. He's recently actually been in contact with myself to advise that he has got a first in his degree, and one of the keys for him was being able to complete his exams at home with his ergonomic setup, with his desk, and he was comfortable, he was able to take breaks, and it really made all the difference. And again, the students fed back about having less stress and anxiety in preparation to the build-up to their exams. And again, just that ability to be able to plan better. A number of them would have met with their assigned mentors, whether it was a mental health mentor or an AS mentor in advance, and they would have planned how they were going to approach those 24-hour exams, etc. as well. Some of the negatives coming back was that online learning was no substitution for in-class teaching. Some of the students, they really missed the social interaction with their peers and with other staff, and a lot of it came down to those informal peer discussions. So a topic was brought up in class, and maybe just afterwards, leaving the lecture hall, they were talking about it over their break for 15 minutes. And all of those little conversations that have been happening previously weren't happening in the same way in the online environment. For some, the 24-hour assessments, some students felt that was really difficult for them to limit the time that they spent completing them. They felt that they had to continually go back on it to improve it or to make it slightly better. And other students made the point that, you know, in terms of referencing for take-home exams, they felt more pressurized that they had to make the referencing of a higher standard, and they were spending a lot more time trying to do that before submitting their work, and they really felt that if their peers are doing it, that they needed to do it too. And then for other students who maybe had a more difficult home environment, the take-home exams were certainly more of a challenge, whether it was very busy households, carrying responsibilities, as well as maybe issues with technology as well, in terms of connectivity to the internet, and even for others in terms of maybe technology poverty as well, you know, and not having access to up-to-date machines as well. So that's really just a flavour of some of the feedback, and that's just through my interactions with some of the students that I have been working with. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more studies and more detailed studies around that give us some real kind of valuable feedback and learning insights. So in terms of assessment choice, I've just got a picture of Albert Einstein up here. And it's in the middle of every difficulty lies opportunity. And I suppose as a disability practitioner, that's how I have felt during the pandemic. It was almost like a big bang theory that has pushed us forward. It has pushed us out of our comfort zones. We now have the opportunity to look at how we can take the advantages of the blended learning and the online learning, and see, can we put those into our I suppose our plans and our actions moving forward. So there's a real opportunity here to kind of take big strides forward. And I suppose I'm raising the question to everybody, assessment choice. So should there be a variety of assessment methods that are given out to learners, and should they be able to opt in? Everybody has their own particular learning styles, and should we have that almost like a menu option for students moving forward? Should we take advantage of this opportunity? So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. And I'm just going to stop sharing now and pass it over to Brian.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Very thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for kind of sharing that in terms of the context of Ulster University. I think that's great when you kind of mix it into the whole of the presentations and the detail and the context that we're discussing this afternoon. Now, I'm quite aware of time and aware of kind of, you know, the panel commitments as well as delegate commitments as well. But there's a couple of comments, I think, on the chat. So one comment from Joe Hastewell. Some students have described studying at home has reduced some of the daily demand on executive functioning. Like you say, one advantage of blended learning. And I think we probably would all heartily agree with that. And then another comment from Nikki Martin, certainly a steep learning curve. LSBU was very good about digital poverty, ensuring students got access to equipment. Their studies would have been impossible otherwise. And I think that, thinking about your question that you posed, that flexibility of model and delivery, and how do students demonstrate their knowledge in a way that actually is identified by the curriculum and content, and therefore the assessment that's needed, I think is all part of that process. We haven't got any questions that have come up on the Q&A, and I'm aware of time, but one of the things I'm going to ask the panel to do, and also delegates, is if you have any questions associated with Stephen's presentation, we're going to have a little bit of time at the end of the session, so feel free to pose any questions in the chat or via the Q&A, and forgive me, Stephen, for having to move on to the next session, but thank you so much. Really thought-provoking, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. we're going to move on to our colleague Valerie from CIHO in Belgium. Valerie, are you there? Hi, Valerie. I think you're on mute, so you might want to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think it's coming. I will.
Yeah,
My share
I can see
screen
that on
now?
my
Yes.
screen, so it's sharing
Okay.
perfectly. So over to you, Valerie.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for the invitation as well. I'm very happy to be here and to represent the work we are doing at CIHO. I have drafted a very short presentation. Maybe it's good to tell you that we are CIHO and we are embedded by decree. So it was at the moment that Belgium ratified the UN conventions on students of persons with disabilities that CIHO was founded. And we are a cooperation between the Flemish government and the 5 university associations. And in that sense, we are supporting 18 higher education institutions in Flanders, 5 universities and 13 universities of applied sciences. And the core task that we have is to support both the Ministry of Education and Government, but also the higher educations in the development of and implementation of equity and inclusion measures for inclusive higher education. Initially, it was focused on students with disabilities, but we have made also a little switch in that area, in that sense that the Minister of Education now in 2020 really appointed CIHO to work on the broad concept of inclusion and inclusive universities. So not only taking the approach solely on students with disabilities. So that's also one of the important concepts that we are mandated now at this moment to support our universities to move towards really inclusive universities. So, and that's also a little bit the initiatives that we are taking, and also a little bit the approach that we are changing towards our universities. Concretely, we are very closely cooperating with our universities. They are really our close colleagues. That's also a little bit an advantage, since Flanders is a little community and we are all near each other, you could say. We are visiting each other in a very short time. One of the topics that we have done is that we have several learning networks, and learning networks are really cooperating in a close manner in working groups, but also in exchanging experience with the main persons at each universities. Also, we are really coaching the universities themselves. So we are supporting universities themselves in drafting a policy plan, implementing a policy plan, and going really hands-on even to the teachers themselves. We also develop some guidelines and tools that might support that process. Sometimes we also are focusing on international cooperation to increase a little bit the efforts that we can do. And in that sense, also on the topic of universal design, we have some international cooperations. For example, now also for our webinar series towards inclusive universities, we are cooperating and doing this approach with Frédéric Fauvet from Canada, for example. I will present today just one little case because it's a little bit showing on what's also the state of play in Flanders and how are we moving further towards the inclusive universities. I have picked up one Odyssey University of Applied Sciences because we also drafted in the book of Frédéric a case study of it, and it's a really good example because it's already served also to inspire other of our universities. So, and based on that case, they are really taking up that approach also in their universities. So just to give the context, in Flanders, when we ratified the UN conventions on persons with disabilities, we had a change also in the higher education legislation, and there at that moment universities were forced to install clear procedures on how to ensure also reasonable adjustments towards students with disabilities. And at that moment we also had a fund in the Flemish community on diversity. It was a matching fund, so universities received a lot of funding by the Flemish government, but they also had to allocate the same funding from their own funding. So we had really an inspiring case at that moment that universities really were forced to work on inclusion. And at that moment, we saw that they were drafting really policy plans on inclusive higher education, and that they foremost installed a really dual track policy. So they already imagined we have to work on universal design, but we saw that they really focused also on target policies towards not only students with disabilities, but also towards students with a migration background and so on. And we saw a little bit a mismatch in that. There was a lot of focus on targeted approach, which was well as well, but it was not really the concept of working towards inclusive universities. We also had a change in 2017 on advice of SIGO. Our Flemish government also installed a new regulation really on inclusive higher education. And that was really giving the responsibility to universities to really install an inclusive continuum approach on the topic of inclusion. And as you can see, it's a little bit referring to the work of Dara, what he was telling at the beginning. I have simplified it here because what we are now doing is we are supporting universities in really making universal design and the broad basic care more strengthened, and we have some guidelines therefore, really tips and tricks also on accessibility, on different approaches, also on student guidance. But we are also taking the approach on really forcing our universities to reflect really on the reasonable adjustments and to force them to embed them more in the broad basic care, so that we have also more inclusive universities. And that's a really tricky approach, but it's we see that it's going well in several universities, and it's also evaluated in a very good sense, both not only by the students themselves, but also by the teacher staffs and academic staff. So for example, in the context of Odyssey University of Applied Sciences, just to give you an impression, that's a rather small, but University of Applied Sciences have 10,500 students, but they have 25 bachelor programs, also located in several cities and campuses across the Flemish community. And we supported them also really to go into a new mission by the year of 2027. Odyssey aims really to become a sustainable, flexible and inclusive co-university of applied sciences. And what was really good in that sense, that we really reflected with them on how can you ensure to make that at a real concrete level, and how can you ensure what they are here promising in their mission statement, to have a really inclusive learning environment with equal educational opportunities for each and every student, based on an active interaction between students, staff and actors from the field. So universal design really forms the starting point. And for this, we started a participatory approach really, and that was by making really a close Udl team in the university, and we were also a little bit the advisor on that. So they had an Udl team composed of staff of the central education, but also diversity, student services, and they really worked in close cooperation with the Educational Council of the university. And what they did was really an examination of what are the reasonable adjustments, which are granted a lot to students, and where are teachers also reflecting on what could we maybe do in a more inclusive way. And we saw at the university level that there were already some good practices. And so we took that opportunity to make a concept note really on what inclusive measures we wanted to install at the university. And then you see the interplay that we have taken to work together with the Educational Council, but also then started the process on consulting each of the programs, the 25 programs that they have, to go in dialogue and so forth. And so we really managed to have the approval and the co-university standing out apart from all the inclusive universities. And then really it was, they changed really also the educational regulations on it, and it's really mandated for the teachers and staff to follow the strict procedures that are now installed. And they put a lot of efforts in communicating this new approach. That was a very important point, because also students with disabilities who were granted reasonable adjustments and now had to live more in a situation where it was standard and now not only an adjustment for them. They really had to communicate that carefully to the students, and some students were a little bit afraid about the situation, but they were reassured that they would really be given the extra time. For example, was one of the measures that was granted in an inclusive way. And so we have started the implementation, and at this moment we are several evaluations further. But just to mention to you is that they really in their educational statements have had to be very concrete on what are we seeing as diversity, how we will create a learning environment. And what was one of the, because they want to be a co-universities, is really that they have also an educational team really supporting all the programs on implementing the new measures in practice. And I think that's one of the success factors of working on inclusion, is that you really are supporting the staff who have to implement the approach. And one of the great things in the approach that we have been doing with them is that students really take the ownership in their own evaluation, their own learning program, and their own learning process. And as said, we have installed inclusive and exam and pedagogical measures. I will go in depth to it, but for example, one of them is that now all students are granted additional time during exams, and also are giving a double preparation time for oral exams. So that's and by default situation, and there are no exceptions on this rule. So teachers have to do it. And what's really important is also that the quality of implementing it is monitored, because teachers are really accepted to write on their exams the time they had foreseen, and then also write additional time, and then that's the inclusive time. So it's also important, because that's really clear also for students, that's the inclusive granted time that they have. So that's an important approach that the university is really asking and giving really concrete templates to implement it for each of the teachers. We also have that not only in assessment, there are 5 other assessment inclusive measures, but we also have that, for example, also in teaching, in that sense that teachers are forced to give their presentation in advance towards students, so that they are really prepared also to take classes and have the PowerPoints and so on in advance. But also, for example, they have to offer examples of appropriate assignments, examples of previous exams, so that really students get an idea on what's a good assignment, what can I expect. And in that sense, students are really supported also in their learning process. And for example, also all classes are recorded. It was pre-COVID time, but that really also gives an incentive for students in an inclusive way, that they also can rewatch the lesson and so on. So what's also one of the important topics is it's not only about implementing, but it's also about evaluating. And in that sense, the university also took its responsibility to focus on the evaluation of the teachers. What do you find of the new measures? And also, do you have additional needs in this implementation? And because we think that's a really important topic to focus and to identify some new additional needs, so that you can also evaluate and, where needed, change a little bit the approach. And we also did that, of course, with students themselves. Are they satisfied? Have they barriers? How are they looking at the situation? And what was good was that it was evaluated relatively very positive. And that's a good sense, because if you have a positive evaluation, you can also communicate that toward the teachers, and also again can engage with them and move for the same goal into higher education. So for example, you see here that a lot of teachers stand behind the measure of extra time, but they had some support sometimes needed to estimate in a good sense the exam time that they are estimating on the copy that they have to write. So in that sense, the educational team again focused on how can we support the quality assurance of our teachers in expecting and estimating a good exam time on the courses that they are giving. So in that sense, I think it's a really nice approach, and I think it's also a value that some external people, as Sicho is a little bit colleagues, but also a little bit on the side, and we are also doing the approach in the other universities that it's a good manner to support a process into that topic. And in that sense, we have now, for example, 4 universities who have already applied some of the inclusive measures and are taking over the approach of other. And that's what we think is also very important, to share the practices, discuss them, and then also feed other processes on that topic. So it's a little bit an approach that I wanted to share, and also that we are really focusing on not only on teaching and learning, what I presented now, but at this moment we are also focusing on mental health, on how can we move further on really designing also the inclusive campuses and campus life for students. So Brian, that's a little bit the message that I wanted to bring out from the Flemish community.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Really, really interesting. And I think I'm pretty sure, as we're kind of working through, and we're going to be moving on to Jennifer shortly, there are some common elements associated with that practice. And I know from the discussions that we've had, Valerie, in the past year, there have been significant developments, haven't there, in Belgium in terms of kind of government decisions and government movement and government support associated with looking at inclusive practice. Now, I think we've probably got time for a quick question before we kind of move on, but I'd like to come back to your presentation as well as Stephen's towards the end of the session as well. Are there any questions? There are no questions on the Q&A. Are there any questions from the panel at all? Do pop your hand up if you need to. Or is that a hand, Dara?
It is, yeah. I was going to kind of ask at the end of the session, but I'll ask it now. It's kind of a reflection, I suppose. But I'm just wondering, Lynn's kind of alluded to it actually in the chat about the reaction of the students to the Odyssey model, whereby the extra time or the accommodations are offered to all. I think it's a really interesting piece around the kind of change management of how, as we move towards more universal design, how we manage the expectations of the lecturers and the students and all of that. So just wondering if you could give any advice based off that model about how that communication took place to the students. Lynn, I think, has mentioned in the chat that they've had some discussions about it there, and they've found complaints from students about you know, but we should have additional time over the additional time sort of thing, if you know what I mean. So any advice?
Yeah, there was a mailing to all the students who already had reasonable adjustments. They were all invited at their assessment process that it's taking place annually at the university. So then it was explained again, but they also really had, how do you say it? They have some screens also in the campuses, and there it was also mentioned really yeah, in a direct way, also on intranet and so on. But I think the individual information toward the students and the assessment process in that was really good, and we have no complaints of students. So that's now running. I said it was running 2018, and they really don't have complaints, but it's also important to tell that in a very concrete way. And it's, for example, it doesn't mean that students only have those inclusive measures. Students know if they have a need that's more specific, they also can add it. And so we see we have still students with disabilities who apply for reasonable adjustments, but it's more a little bit the complex cases that they are receiving. And we are seeing that the more general disabilities like dyslexia and so on are asking less reasonable adjustments. But I think the open atmosphere that they really also can ask extra measures if needed, that make it. But what Odyssey is saying, we are teaching it and saying it each year, and it's very important to do it to freshman students as well, students who are enrolling, because they are really coming from secondary education where there's not really already an inclusive approach installed. So I think that's really important to mention. Then again, what's the rationale? And by doing it concretely, for example, on an exam copy, you are reassuring that you are giving them really the right of additional time. And that's I think an important topic. Yeah.
I think as well the sort of increase in the use of open book exams in the last year, the massive explosion in the use of those, I think is going to help us to sell those messages as well, both to the academic staff and the students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Dara. I'm just going to read out one comment. Excuse me. That was posted by Paddy, and it was, I think it's in relation to one of the points that you made, and it said, yes, enough time is what is needed, not artificial speed tests of 1 to 2 hours that have extremely limited application outside education. And I think that's a very important comment, and I think there is something in that which is about, and it goes back down to the flexibility of the model, and also I think kind of feeding into the point that you've kind of made, and actually all the slides that have been presented so far have made, which is about kind of feeding into the anticipatory nature of what we do and thinking ahead and thinking about that in terms of design. Thank you ever so much, Valerie.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and Deborah's popped something in. One of the reasons that time has become such a debated metric in many UK universities, in my opinion, is because additional time is the clearest adjustment being made for a host of impairments. Perhaps if students believe they were experience other kinds of accommodations, they might worry less about relative time. And this is, well, we could talk about time forever, ironically. You know, and time is a construct, and in some ways, actually, we can play around with time, and in some ways we don't always think about things in that way. And I think that flexibility of our use of time and how we work directly to include time in our thinking and our design inclusively is a really important part of that process. I'm going to introduce you now to Jennifer, who's been very patient as we've kind of worked our way through the presentations today. And so I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer, who is joining us from the University of Kentucky and is co-chair of the UDL HE organization, who are also based in the US. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, everybody. So we'll just dive right in. So I'm at the University of Kentucky, and I don't know if folks are real clear on where that is, so I'm just gonna show it to you. We're not, you know, Kentucky's not as popular as like New York and LA. So here we are, right there in the middle of the country. And what are we known for in Kentucky? Well, we're known for bluegrass music, Kentucky bourbon, thoroughbred horses, and of course, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I'm about, where I live is about maybe 40 minutes away from the original KFC, which is very exciting. Oddly, my children have never had Kentucky Fried Chicken. They just not interested. So we, at the University of Kentucky, we decided to join with one of our education professors, our educational psychology professors, to do a really large scale study for us. And we wanted to find out what were the effects on teaching and learning during COVID. And so we got together 111 instructors, and these were all volunteers. Those instructors taught a combined total of 261 course sections. And then the number of students that we ended up surveying or interviewing for this study was over 7,000. So that's quite a bit, a pretty good number, and that's been helpful to give us some some pretty broad information. So the way that this study was designed, it was in 3 phases. So phase 1 was a survey that went out early in the fall, I believe in August. Phase 2 was, we took that survey from August. We had a follow-up survey with the same students in November. And then we also took sort of the end of course things like course grades. We looked at demographics, student majors, GPAs, things like that. So we put all of that data together from the 2 surveys and then sort of the student information. And then our 3rd phase, which was in the spring of 2021, we interviewed some students, we interviewed some of the instructors to just get some feedback on things we'd found through the surveys. So our study has 4 main areas of focus. And you'll see those depicted here on the screen. Just very quickly, new instructional possibilities. Modality has been a big topic of conversation for us, with folks talking about teaching online, teaching in person, teaching a hybrid model. What's the most effective? What has worked for students? Community and belonging was an important part for us. We wanted to address things like socioeconomic barriers, but also technology barriers, barriers for our faculty with technology and things like that. My area of focus was course organization. I am just really obsessed with how courses are organized online. I find that to be really important. It has been important for me as a student, and I know that it's very important for a lot of the students in this setting as well. And so when we moved to this entire semester, well, year and a half actually, of online teaching, that really shifted a lot of things for instruction and the organization of our courses online. So I am really interested in looking at executive functions and how organizing your course impacts students' executive function. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. In the spirit of UDL, we'll give you a quick background information. So executive functions, when we're referring to executive functions, we're talking about these kinds of things, right? The actions that we take, focus, emotions, memory, effort, activation, organization, time management, that kind of thing. And these things we know are very important for the act of teaching and learning. And when they are not supported, a lot of students struggle, and many of those students tend to be students with disabilities. And so I wanted to look specifically for some of the executive functions that are correlated with universal design for learning, right? And so this is in the bottom right-hand corner of the UDL guidelines. And so I'm really looking at these things: guiding appropriate goal setting, supporting planning and strategy development, monitoring progress, and managing your information and resources. So after we looked into some of the information, I started to come up with some questions that I wanted to know. So how are these organized? So I wanted to figure out which instructors were really well organized. And I wanted to know, for those instructors who organized their courses really well, how were they actually supporting students' executive functions? Now, I don't think a lot of our instructors set out thinking, I just really want to support students' executive functions. I don't really know that they have a grasp on what that means necessarily, but I think what they were doing is they were addressing the needs of their students and trying to be proactive about that. And many of the things that they were doing were in fact supporting students' executive functions. So I wanted to know, how does this look in classes? Are there common elements between these different instructors that are doing really well organized work online? And what are those things? So I really focused in on the interviews from phase 3. And I went through and determined what instructors were really well organized using a variety of criteria. And I came up with this list of about 13 instructors. And these are instructors for whom students in their courses took the surveys and said things like, wow, this class was really well organized, or I really appreciated how everything I needed was in one place. So after I determined that list of well-organized instructors, then I went back and interviewed students in their courses. And so after doing that, these are some of the things that I found students had to say about what was really helpful in this course that made it well organized, and like, how did that support me and me keeping myself organized as a student? One of the things that we actually heard through a lot of the surveys was that students were having a lot more trouble self-regulating at home in their home situations, right? Because they were really not on campus as much, especially last fall and the spring before. And so how were they doing that? You know, some of them had they were at home with their families. And so some of them also had to help with younger siblings and had to be helping the younger siblings do their online coursework, right? So there were a lot of things going on, and that tended to really affect students' executive function. So these are the common elements that we found after interviewing students. These are the things that they said consistently. In fact, most of them mentioned these things. These are the things my instructors were doing. So their instructors who were really well organized were making sure that their schedules were consistent from week to week. So if you always go in and do a discussion board post on Tuesdays, then I know as a student how I can kind of budget my time better. So having that consistent schedule that on Tuesdays we usually do this, on Fridays we usually do this, that was really helpful. They mentioned having a lot of opportunities for formative assessment, so practice tests, quizzes that were, they could drop the lower 2 grades just so that they could have that practice of going in and practicing the things that they'd learned. Another element that they mentioned was that the assessment expectations were made very clear. There were no questions. They didn't have to ask anything. They knew exactly what was being required of them. Some of the other instructors, you'll see number 4 there, have provided an estimated amount of time. So they might say, you'll be reading chapter 4, and this should take you approximately 45 minutes to read. And that students found that to be really helpful also in organizing their time and keeping themselves, keeping their time managed really well in that home setting. We heard a lot of students talk about their course calendar being organized by a daily schedule, as opposed to all of these things are due by this one day. They found it to be really helpful when the instructor would say, hey, it's probably going to be helpful for you to do this on Monday, do this on Tuesday, do this on Wednesday, etc. We found a lot of students mentioned that they got weekly reminder emails, and those emails were very helpful to keep them on task. We also heard a lot about communication being made a top priority with these organized instructors. Some even gave out their cell phone numbers, which I was pretty impressed by. And some students did take advantage of that, and in a good way, and emailed them or texted them when they had questions. And we know that our students are not as likely to come to in-person or even Zoom office hours as they are to send you a text message. We heard about feedback being very clear and being very frequent. And finally, one of the things that students consistently mentioned was that our learning management system at the University of Kentucky, we have Canvas. That Canvas was set up as a one-stop shop, meaning that students didn't have to go outside of Canvas to find the resources they needed to do their assignments and to access their content. Everything was in that one place, and they found that really helpful. So those are the common elements that we heard from students. And when we went back and talked to the instructors later and interviewed them, these are some of the things they mentioned. We asked them, so, students have said your course is really well organized. What do you think they're mentioning? And what do you think they're talking about when they say that? And these are some of the things that they also mentioned. So these seem to be proactive planning elements that they are putting in place to really support students. So if we look back to those 4 UDL executive function checkpoints that are listed there, if I break up these 9 things that we talked about, these common elements, and I organize them by the 4 checkpoints, they all kind of fit. So you'll see all of those are there. Supporting planning and strategy development, for example, well, the instructors were doing that by sending reminder emails, by providing the estimated amount of time this assignments would take, and by organizing their course calendar in a daily schedule so that students were able to really manage their time well when they were in kind of an unpredictable home setting. And so all of those things that they mentioned really do fit right in with Universal Design for Learning. So our next steps, we are hoping to have some other researchers come in and independently code the interviews so that we can get that inter-rater reliability, which is of course really important when you're doing qualitative work. We hope to put this information together and write an article about our findings, and then eventually we're going to hopefully go through and help some instructors to change what they have in their course using the information that we've learned and doing an intervention type study so that we can really see what the impact of proactively planning to support executive functioning really does in a college classroom environment. So I'm going to stop there. I've been ignoring the chat so that I can focus on what I'm doing, but I am going to go back in now real quick and peek in there. Did anyone see anything pop up in the chat that we want to make sure we address?
I think people were just talking about how the approach feels incredibly helpful, and I think for me what stands out is just how intuitively common sense a lot of these things are, and yet we still need to provide those signposts for our academic services. One thing, sorry Brian, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here by jumping in, but now one thing that I'm interested in is, like, you know, Valerie's talked about really good approaches there around assessment and stuff, and operationalizing them, if you know what I mean, and at a sort of systems level. So I wondered, did you have any thoughts about how those kind of things can be, you know, can be sort of built in across an institution, other than just giving your academics guidance? Is there other things that can, if you like, encourage that in a more systemic way?
Yeah, I think that's our goal, you know, eventually to go forward and to do that, to perhaps create some kind of a model that shows instructors, if you want to make sure you're planning for your students to have success in the areas of executive function, when we know so many students are struggling with that, here are the things that have been shown to be helpful. And so that is the goal. Yeah, that's what we're hoping to go forward and do. And I'm thinking of something along the lines of the Quality Matters rubric. I don't know if you all are familiar with Quality Matters, but it's a sort of a, I guess, quality assessment tool that one uses to evaluate online courses. And one piece of that is organization, but I think this really hones in on that part that we know so many students struggle with. And I would like to see that become more of a model that we use for planning.
Yeah, one that jumps into my mind of a thing they did in Dublin City University here was that they created an online course template on their Moodle platform that, if you like, sort of mandated some of the things that you're talking about as part of the way instructors load up their materials, and so they're always sort of pinged to answer those questions about how long is this going to take to engage with and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And I don't know how this works in other countries, but in the US, our instructors do not like to be told what to do. So when we give them a thing and say, you have to do this, they get a little fussy about that. And so we do have some templates also that are already organized in that way, that are using these same ideas and these same elements of organization. And some do use them. Sometimes they'll adopt them in a department, and so the department will all use the same template, which they found to be really helpful for students in that major, because they're now seeing consistently the same things in the same places from course to course. And so, yeah, that would be great. I would love to mandate that. I don't know that would go over super well. But yeah, agreed. I mean, if we know this is helpful, we know this is going to be useful for students and probably also for instructors. I mean, the less questions and emails you have to answer about where do I find this, or I forgot to figure out this thing, how do I go in and do, I mean, like, the less emails you have to answer as an instructor, that's the more time you're going to have to do other things. So it ends up actually being really beneficial for all parties involved.
Yeah, and I just think in addition to that, Nikki Martin has kind of posted a couple of comments really saying that she's very interested in raising the profile of professional services staff as equal partners with academics with the same access to CPD and participation in research. We are all in it together, which I think kind of is a really good way of kind of pulling all of that together. And I think we would all agree actually that that link between professional services and academic development is one that actually goes hand in hand when approached in the right way and serves itself well in terms of actually fulfilling inclusive design in its totality. Excellent. So are there any more questions from the panel, particularly for Jennifer, before we move into kind of a more of a whole group Q&A? Okay, thank you ever so much, Jennifer. So we will be, I've been jotting down a few questions and a few have kind of come my way. We've got a particular question that was posted on the Q&A section a little bit earlier. And I think we'll start there because that was quite early on in the session itself. And it was from Joe Hastewell. And the question is, I'd be interested in the levels of engagement by academic departments in your different context and what has helped this. So I think this links really nicely into that discussion that you just had with Dara, Jennifer, but I think it also lends itself quite wider to kind of the other presentations and the other presenters. So feel free to unmute yourselves and chip away. You don't have to kind of put hands up or anything like that. It's a discussion.
Certainly in the ahead context, I suppose we have that tricky line to walk because we're an NGO that's focused on disability, and yet one of our core strategic aims is to promote universal design for learning, which of course is about addressing variability much more broadly. And there is often that thing of like, we're trying to go into the academic sphere and say, you know, try to tell people about teaching and learning, and they're rightly saying, you know, who are you to tell me how to teach, you know, and that's absolutely fair enough. So I suppose what we've done is taken a much more collaborative approach, and we've engaged with our national body for excellence in teaching and learning, formed a really strong partnership with them. So I suppose getting them on board early doors so that we're engaging as a community with the different institutions. And that's why I mentioned earlier our national CPD program has been really valuable, because it is a nationally recognized CPD that's accredited by the body responsible for excellence in teaching and learning. So, you know, it holds much more cachet than a head badge would of its own in the teaching and learning community. So that's one way, I suppose, that we've increased our engagement with academics much more. I don't want to sit here and pretend that if you go into any random course in an Irish context, you're going to be sitting there engaging with a beautifully university designed curriculum. But I think we're making real progress in that most of the institutions now are engaging in UDL projects around Ireland. Some of them have it heavily embedded in the sort of systematic processes of the university now, and we're starting to see that pay off in terms of, you know, it's embedded in programmatic review across the institution, whole scale CPD, and even in terms of how we deliver the national badge itself, it's kind of a delivered in partnership. So most of the institutions actually have local facilitators who sort of manage the rollout. Even though we deliver it centrally, they manage the sort of local flock of people who are engaging with the course. So there's always this kind of national connection but a local connection as well, and it's all happening at the same time across the whole country, you know. So it means that there's a lot of national dialogue that takes place around it in the teaching and learning community. So I think that's one way to increase it, because something, if suddenly it feels like a really cool party, you know, oh, I want to get involved in that party, rather than something that you're going to academics and saying, no, you've been doing this wrong, you know.
I think you're right. This is about cohesion, isn't it? And I think if you've got that kind of national backing and support, then it makes that whole process simpler and easier and much more consistent when it's applied. Thank you, Dara. How does that apply to other people on the panel in terms of respective countries, respective context? Have you got similar experiences? And I'm thinking of colleagues in the Netherlands, Northern Ireland, etc., and also the UK. And Lynn's on as well, so feel free to chip in, Lynn. I think it'll be interesting to know what those differences are, because I can say from a UK perspective, whilst we work closely with government, it isn't cohesive in the way that you've just described, Dara, and I think that there's an interesting dynamic shift associated with that.
Brian, I suppose I'll come in here from a Northern Irish perspective. I think I have mentioned to you before about how I feel we're still looking outward. So we're looking at some of the best practice, particularly around UDL, Jennifer and the whole CAST model and everything else. And then also Dara and his colleagues at AHEAD have been fantastic at pushing that, and even within the Republic of Ireland and the universities there, there's a lot of best practice that I think we can all learn from. I suppose at an institutional level, I touched upon it during my presentation about as a disability service or a student wellbeing team, how we actually engaged with our Centre for Higher Research, Practice and Education. So that is the academics. So we collaborated on a lot of these projects to get the message across to the other academics, because if it come directly from disability services, there may be a little bit more resistance. So you're constantly walking that line of, you know, telling us how to do our jobs kind of correctly when this is what we do full time, you know, and it's that, I suppose, breaking down those silos and working collaboratively within your institution to see we have this shared end goal that we want to get to. What's the best way of us doing that without putting anybody's nose out of joint in the process, and kind of, I suppose, encouraging that kind of culture change. So I suppose that's how we've kind of addressed it, and those joint workshops that we would have had with student wellbeing and with CHIRP, and then coming together and offering those workshops on UDL to the staff teams as well, you know, open to professional support staff as well, and kind of, I suppose, building that mutual respect that Nicola picked up on there as well, between teams, and I suppose the contribution that the likes of wellbeing services and disability services can contribute, you know, to this overall UDL approach.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in there in terms of, and I think you used the word culture, and we all know working in education that a change or a shift or in dynamic of culture takes time, and sometimes you have to plug away at it, and that silo mentality, I think, we can easily be sucked into that, which is, let's get on with the work that we're doing, let's take each day as it comes, etc. But that bit which is kind of looking up and looking outward is the important factor in joining together collaboratively and actually working towards a shared goal. Deborah, have you got your hand up there?
I have, yeah. So I was going to hover above this perhaps and look at this on a sort of sector-wide basis and perhaps be controversial. So I'm going to be a bit controversial in the sense that I think what we're all trying to do here is to move beyond the usual suspects. You know, those colleagues who we know are passionate, who will always be there in the workshops, who will always be there trying and being innovative, and you know, how do we move past that? And in the UK, I think that there are a couple of different things that are almost that are part of the context, and I do think that one of them is and I know people won't like this, but it is the use of metrics. It is the fact, you know, that increasing use of metrics by the OFS, you know, not just about awarding gaps, but which are significant and statistically significant and are still there, but also that, you know, those metrics on different graduate outcomes and on those differences in student experiences. Okay, more controversially still, I'd love to see some of those in league tables, right? So that if we've got to live in a horrible world with league tables, let's at least have some that actually talk about the experience of all students. And so if, you know, but I also think that the increasing student voice and the increasing space for student complaints and the fact that students can now ask for significant amounts of financial damages, I think that's really good. And I think that's really good because it means that we're going to widen out past those great people who we know will be our champions and get people from different aspects, and also get university management generally, you know, thinking through what are the innovative ways that they can work in this space. So I know it's controversial, but I guess it's sort of saying, in this world we're in, can we get those metrics to work for us? Can we get the you know, the sort of student complaint system to work for us? And isn't that's not where we want to be in the long run, right? But where we are now, maybe where we are now, you know, the more disabled students that complain about their experiences really early on, at least if that can lead to something good happening so that those experiences don't happen again. So just to widen it out.
I think that's an excellent point, Deborah. And a quote that I can share, it was in part of my training many years ago, was there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. And I think failure is a fear in the sector of getting it wrong, rather than thinking about student feedback being something that contributes to a positive set of outcomes or positive set of developments. And I think the metrics that you mentioned, I think, are hugely part of that, and I think the sense of value is also part of that. We should open up that up to the rest of the panel. What are your comments associated with that? And feel free, you know, Deborah did mention it might be controversial. Feel free to kind of disagree or to challenge, because this is coming from different perspectives, and I think we would value your perspective.
Sorry, go on, you go, Judith.
Yes, just we start thinking about when you become inclusive, you have to discuss the moments you are exclusive. And I think that's also a very useful way to look at the moments when a teacher or a student is thinking or feeling excluded. It's so helpful to learn and to make it happen to become inclusive again. So I'm not sure if that's adding something you are saying, Deborah, but I think that's also very important aspect of becoming inclusive. And the other thing I just mentioned, the question you asked before, Brian, and so for us it was very helpful again to make a combination between flexibility and inclusion, and especially on the changing role of the lecturer or the teacher, as Martina already mentioned, because I think we all see that the teacher is becoming more a coach, a supportive role besides being the expert or the teacher. And that also for us is also very useful if we start talking about the sense of belonging or being a supporter, belonging. That's also, then we combine it to the issues of well-being. And in main end, we think where there's a changing of being the supportive role of education becomes, I think, equal important as the role of teaching students to become very good in their profession. So we dream for 50-50 role of education, supportive role and coaching role, and I don't know how to say this in correct English, but in the teaching role no, don't know, just so that's another issue, and we use this changing role of teachers. We learned in the flexibility area, and make that happen also for sense of belonging, well-being, and supports.
I think perfectly said is what I'm going to say to Judith. I would say there's a really important point in what you said that I think I'm right in thinking, which is we're not just thinking necessarily about that point in education that a student may be in. So if they're at higher education, it doesn't matter whether they're at higher education level or a statutory education before that, but also the societal impact. So if we get inclusion right at the education level, then society in itself has much more of an opportunity to create an inclusive environment much more holistically. And I think there is that longer term projection of actually, if we put the effort in now in education with the passion that we have and that spirit of working together, then that influences change out there in the real world when students graduate and go out into the world of employment. Would that be right? In terms of what your point was. Does that make sense?
No, that was another point I could have made as well. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dara, you very kindly passed on to Judith, but I'm going to pass.
Sorry, I actually think Lynn had her hand up first, even. I only just noticed that.
You're very kind, Dara. Over to Lynn.
I was just going to say that one of the best pieces of advice I had as a very junior disability advisor was to keep a stack of complaints forms in your drawer, so that when students came in and you tried to address things and they weren't getting addressed, you could give them a complaints form and encourage them to complain. But in the UK, we have two ways of complaining. First of all, you go through complaints at the university, and quite often that will help. But after that, there's two ways forward. One is which they go to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, in which case stats are actually published and the university is required to take action, or they go through solicitor and sue the university. And they get money out of that. They may get course fees refunded, but the university learns nothing. because it's generally settled out of court. The insurance companies say, yeah, well, this is the student might win this, so therefore we'll pay the costs, rather than actually the university learning anything. And I always used to talk to the students about actually going the route of the independent adjudicator, so that the university would learn something. So yes, I agree with you, Deborah. I think we need to encourage complaints, because it's the only way the university learns, but we also need to encourage them in the right way.
Do you mind if I jump in there, Brian? Is that okay? Yeah. Like, I would have sort of grave concerns about publishing a league table. My own view is that there's far too much competition within our higher education system already, and that you know, like there's a lot of competition already even within the student body that I think is meaningless and is actually totally at odds with the nature of what we should be trying to do with education more generally. I think it's useful to have the kind of carrot and the stick. I would fully agree with you in that context, but I think we need to be very, very careful about treading that line, and that we don't create, I suppose, in and around inclusion, a very kind of adversarial nature of how we go about things, that we always come at it from as an adversarial point of view. I think we actually need to ensure, again, that we try to develop systems that massively encourage that, or reward inclusion, if you like. So I'm thinking of things like within our funding models, you know, how can we reward inclusion within the way that we fund the universities? Things like, I'll give it a great example is the Athena Swan model for gender inclusion, and within the academic student body. It's been so successful in pushing inclusion, and yeah, it's actually a positive award. You achieve an award for Athena Swan, but if you don't achieve that award, there's consequences from a funding perspective. You know, you don't get access to X, Y, or Z funding stream. So I think there's a kind of a balance in that approach that I think we need to strike, because I think once we get into the realm of, if you bit like what Jen was alluding to earlier on, they don't get on very well when you tell an academic that you have to do something. Whereas if we can create a sort of infrastructure where we can maybe, so if we were to develop the Athena Swan model, for example, for around universal design, that we collaboratively as a sector build a universal design charter, which we all feel is reasonable, achievable, and includes the voice of both students and academics and the institutions and how it's designed, and pushes us forward in that way. And also at the same time then giving that like the reward to our academics. Like, I think there's a lot for us to think about in things of like the way our higher education is structured, and this is obviously a long-term conversation we're talking about here. We reward research far more than we do teaching, and I think there's a real conversation to be had across higher education about what is it that we value most in higher education, and how within the reward structure of things like academic promotion, academic achievement at a local level in terms of institutional awards, you know, do we actually value inclusion, and do we value inclusive teaching practice as part of that conversation, as part of a conversation around quality in teaching and learning.
Thank you, Dara. I was muted. I was just talking to myself. That I think you've made an excellent point, and I think it's also part of a wider discussion, a deeper discussion. I'm looking at the time, and I wish we had more time, because I know that there were some points that had come up in the chat. I know Deborah had a couple of other points as well to make, and John Harding's made an excellent point in the chat as well. However, before we wrap up, one of the things that I'll be sharing with delegates today is that the group, actually, Deborah, you might not be aware of this, but I will invite you if you can join us. We have agreed that we will record a post-conference podcast. So part of what we want to do is follow up on the discussion from today and pick up on 3 or 4 key points, and actually have an active group discussion and upload that so that you're able to kind of listen to that audio only with transcript at a time that you feel comfortable with, because I think there's much more appetite for some deeper discussion. I think there's a huge degree of value out of having not only the discussion that we've just picked up on, but a few other points. And I will just kind of list a couple of those points. One point was going back to Valerie's presentation on cooperation to support various universities, and wondering whether we can increase joint working across UK universities as the sector has become so competitive. And I think it goes back to the point, Dara and Deborah, that you were making, which is about the going back to the metrics and their, you know, the competitive aspect that goes there. And also about the development of the post-qualification admissions process in and across higher education in the UK, which is currently in development and has been recently consulted on. So I think there are some aspects that I think will be great for some further discussion for us as a group. Deborah, I will absolutely invite you to that, and my apologies for not mentioning it to you before now in front of our delegates, who I'm sure will understand my brain fog from time to time. So we will wrap there. I'd really like to thank all of our panelists for today. Dara, you've been wonderful. Deborah, fabulous. Thank you for joining us and actually adding that insight and actually posing the questions that sometimes it's like, well, it might be controversial, but sometimes we need to have conversations in an active way to really fully think things through and learn from that experience. So I really valued the questions and that you've posed today. Judith and Martine, you've been fabulous, and your session was excellent, and I particularly loved the pathway dynamic. And I know there was this assumption that we probably all have seen something similar to that. I'm going to hesitate and say I'm pretty sure not everyone will have seen it, but I think just looking at that and also thinking about the dynamics of that pathway, I think are really useful for people to refer to. I'm going to thank Valerie, who's unfortunately had to leave us before the end of the discussion today because she had a very important meeting to go to, but she will be joining us for the podcast later. Thank you also to Stephen for your session, and my apologies actually because we've not been able to come back to you with any particular questions, but if you're an NADP member, feel free to I'm saying feel free to, Stephen might shake his head at this, but feel free to message Stephen either via the list with any questions relating, because I think there's some shared learning there, but also I think that's another part that we can perhaps as a group pick up in the podcast as and when we record it. And very specifically, a massive thank you to Jennifer for joining us, because I'm just going to do my maths. Now it is around about 10 o'clock, am I right, in Kentucky? And so when you started the session, it was 8 o'clock. So I really value your input, and also trying to manage and balance life outside of that as well in the process. But I'm delighted that you've all been able to join us, and hopefully have I mentioned everyone? Please shake your head if I haven't. Lastly, I'd like to thank Lynn for hosting the session today, doing the introductions, but also in all of the planning that Lynn and the office team have done in order to make the conference what it is, and also to make this session what it is today, as well as our close colleagues in CareScribe, who I think are delightful and wonderful and were so supportive, particularly at the beginning of this session, whereby it was quite noticeable that we were having some technical difficulties that were very, very swiftly dealt with. And so thank you to CareScribe for their ongoing support. I'll pass you back to Lynn for any kind of closing comments before we leave, but thank you ever so much. And a goodbye from me, and it's a goodbye from our panel, and you'll hopefully hear from us very soon.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and thank you to all the panelists. Nothing more for me to say. I won't keep you any longer, but don't forget that week 5, our CPD week, is open for booking now, and I'm sure Paddy will love to see you all. Thank you.